welcome to The Sun Will Rise. I'm Roshan Mohammed Salih. Israel claims to be the only democracy in the Middle East, but Palestinians are increasingly saying that it's attempting to drive a wedge between Muslims and Christians. Earlier this year, the Israelis introduced a Knesset bill identifying Palestinian Christians with Israeli citizenship as non-Arabs. And now the Israelis are launching a recruitment drive to try and get Palestinian Christians to join the army. This is happening as Pope Francis made a high-profile visit to the region. On today's show, we'll be looking at the long history of Muslim-Christian solidarity in Palestine, a solidarity born out of mutual suffering. And we'll be asking if Israel's divide-and-rule tactics have any chance of success. But first, here's Nell Burden with a report from the West Bank on how Palestinian Christians are reacting to the Israeli initiatives.
Christians and Muslims have coexisted in historic Palestine for over 14 centuries. However, a new initiative by the Israeli Defense Forces to conscript Palestinian Christians into the army may be used as a tool to strategically divide the two communities. In January 2014, the Israelis introduced the Knesset bill, which would identify Palestinian Christians with Israeli citizenship as non-Arabs. Then in March 2014, a propaganda campaign began to send voluntary enlistment forms for the Israeli army to all Palestinian Christians turning 17 years old.
It's not questions of allying themselves with the Christian community in Israel. The question is to divide between the people from the same blood, from the same ethnicity, from the same history. Muslims and Christians. We lived together for 14 centuries.
The Israeli army have made claims on their website that they have enlisted over 100 Palestinian Christians into the army, with more working in national service. Orthodox Archbishop of Jerusalem Attila Hanna and former Latin Patriarch Michael Sabah have urged all Christians to ignore the Israeli propaganda and tear up the enlistment forms.
I think we've had cases of some few Christians and some few Muslims joining the Israeli army before. Now, we believe it's any attempt the Israeli government might have in order to divide Christians from Muslims, it will be only cosmetical because, in fact, Christians and Muslims suffer from the same. They are all Palestinians.
The Christian community in Beit Jal in the West Bank are currently fighting a court battle at the Supreme Courts with the Israeli authorities, who seek to seize hundreds of acres of Palestinian land by building the wall directly through the Palestinian Christian-owned Kremazem Valley and Beit Jala. They claim Israel is playing a double-handed game by attempting to recruit Christians to advocate seizing land from their own people.
It's Israel's idea to evacuate Christian community from Palestine and Israel. So they are taking our future from us. They are taking our land, and you know the importance of land in the Holy Bible for the Arab community.
Friar Shamali claimed the Christian church remains too strong to be manipulated into the Israeli army by the occupation, as both Muslims and Christians have suffered from discrimination in Israeli law against Palestinians, which has included land expropriation, settlement expansion, and racist attacks referred to as price tagging by Israeli settlers against their churches and sanctuaries. The majority of Palestinian Christians remain opposed to the new move and say they will do everything to prevent the new law, which they claim is being used to manipulate and politicise the cultural and religious differences in order to weaken the Palestinian national movement. Nell Burden for The Sun Will Rise, occupied Ramallah.
To discuss the situation of Palestinian Christians, we have two guests with us in the studio today. Reverend Stephen Sizer is a Christian priest who's made several fact-finding trips to Palestine, and Mamoun Al-Abbasi is a journalist who's the news editor at the new Middle East Eye website. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for coming in today. Stephen, if I could start with you. Obviously, there's this recruitment drive that Israel is launching, trying to get Palestinian Christians to join the IDF. Are they going to join in droves?
Very unlikely. A small minority might for economic reasons. There's high unemployment among the Palestinians in Israel. They're treated as second-class citizens. There's discrimination. I think this is a cynical attempt by the Israelis to divide Christians from the Muslims. Israel depends heavily on Western Christian support for its existence, Christian Zionists, for example. But I don't think that many Palestinian Israelis are going to take a poison chalice.
I mean, when people think of Palestine, they often think of it as an Arab issue, Palestinian issue, but also a Muslim issue. But let's not forget that there are a lot of Christians in Palestine, and they've suffered like the Muslims have suffered, right?
Many of them have suffered doubly because before 1948, most Arab Christians lived in West Jerusalem. If they were living in the Jerusalem area, they had smaller families, they were perhaps better educated than their Muslim friends, so they lived in West Jerusalem. So in 1948 they lost their homes. When Israel was founded, they became a higher proportion of Christians became refugees, and then in 1967 they became refugees again. So at least 60% or more of Arab Christians, Palestinian Christians, are living in the diaspora as refugees or have emigrated to the West.
Mamoun, if I can come to you, I mean, historically we know that Palestinian Christians, like Muslims, have suffered from Israeli occupation and the events of 48 and 67. But are they still suffering today? Is there still systematic discrimination towards Palestinian Christians today?
Yes, absolutely, and they are discriminated against in the same way that Muslims are discriminated against, and they are leaving in large numbers because of that discrimination. Sometimes some of the Christians have churches or relatives overseas that help them to migrate, whereas their Muslim counterparts don't, but they're both under pressure, under the same amount of pressure.
And places which are very historic to Christians and have special spiritual meaning, like Bethlehem, for example, are effectively being choked by the occupation?
Yeah, I mean, the most of surveys of Palestinian Christians, their number one complaint is the Israeli occupation, is the settlements, is the travel restrictions. So yeah, and that's their main reason of flocking.
Yeah. So I mean, Stephen, often the Israelis will say that to the Christians, you shouldn't be fearing us, you should be fearing Muslim extremists, Muslim fundamentalism. What do you say to that?
They're using this as a fear tactic to mask the reality of the occupation. 80% of Bethlehem has been stolen by the ring of settlements around Bet Jala, Bet Sahur. The separation wall has cut Arab Christians and Muslims off from their land, their agricultural arable land. So it's the occupation, the discrimination, the land confiscation, the home demolitions. Even in the last couple of weeks, one of the Christian families south of Bethlehem, they run a ministry called Tent of Nations, where they seek to bring people together, the different faith communities. They had 1,400 trees demolished. No security at all. The Israelis are seeking to steal their land and consolidate their hold around Bethlehem.
And quickly, Mamoun, I mean, there's no precedent, is there, for Palestinian Christians collaborating with Israel, is there? Historically, they just haven't done that.
Not as a community, no. And they only have to look at what's happening to the Druze minority to understand that you can serve in the Israeli army. That only means you get shot at or you endanger your life, but you'll still be treated as a second-class citizen. So I think the Christians have learned from that experience. A lot of it is directed at overseas, where Christian Americans who support Israel are really unaware. In their vision, they have this missionary vision where they're supporting Israel for the sake of supporting Christianity.
We are going to discuss that a little bit later on, but for the moment we're going to move on. We try our best to include your views and comments on this show, which you've been leaving on our social media pages. So here's Camelia Shambayati with what you've been saying about Israel's attempts to divide Palestinian Christians and Muslims.
Thanks, Roshan. So earlier this year, Israel introduced a Knesset bill which would identify Palestinian Christians with Israeli citizenship as non-Arabs. We therefore asked you, how have Palestinian Christians suffered under Israel, and what does Israel hope to achieve through their games of divide and rule? Let's take a look at our Facebook wall. So Ali from Algeria has messaged us saying, most Christians in America have no idea that hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Christians have suffered terribly under the Zionist regime. They have been driven from their homes, their farms, their businesses, and their homelands by the Zionists. Mohammed from Nigeria's message saying, the Vatican should call on all the Roman Catholics to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel. You can't call yourself a Christian and support Israel. Israel has been terrorizing Christians for decades. Let's also check out a couple of emails. And Richard from Canada has emailed us saying, Western media never report these crimes against Christians in case it influences their audience. Most of the time, when they report Israeli aggression against Christians, they tend to frame it as an Israeli act towards Arabs. Samra from Jordan says, if you drew a Nazi symbol on a synagogue in New York City, it would be on the front pages of the newspapers. But when Israeli settlers vandalize a mosque and a church, and if it does get reported in the Western media, it's a very small headline near the bottom of the page. Let's also check out Twitter. Javier from Spain has tweeted, price tag attacks are at worst terrorism and at best hate crimes. Sami from the US says, Israel wants a sectarian war in the region. They want to divide and conquer Arabs. If the Arabs united, they would be a threat to Israel. That's all we have for you this week. And don't forget, for your chance to have your comments read out on the show, you can send us an email or engage with us via social media by posting messages on our Facebook page, The Sun Will Rise Show, or you can visit our Twitter page where you can follow us on @SunWillRiseShow. And don't forget to hashtag #SunWillRise. Back to you, Roshan.
Thank you, Camelia. Gentlemen, I do want to come back and ask you to comment on a few of those tweets that were left on our social media pages. Stephen, first of all, the Vatican and Israel. The Pope has visited the Holy Land. Has the Vatican had a good kind of... I mean, they're never going to call for a boycott of Israel, are they?
It's very unlikely. The Vatican has had a love-hate relationship with Israel over the years. The Israelis accused the Vatican of complicity in the Holocaust. There were a small number of very brave Catholic priests who defended Jews and protected them during the war, but they tended to turn a blind eye to what Hitler was doing. And so the Israelis, or Zionists, have exploited that over the years to keep the Catholic Church from criticizing Israel's treatment of
Do they have much influence over Palestinian Christians? The Vatican?
The Catholic Church is one of the largest denominations in Palestine, and most of their priests are Arab Palestinians, and therefore they represent the people themselves. So yes, potentially the Pope and the Vatican has enormous clout. It could have, because it can galvanize Christian support in the West to join the boycotts, divestments.
But they're not doing that because the issue is quite sensitive.
It's
given
still
the Second World War.
sensitive. You know, there's a carrot and the stick. The fear of being accused of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, guilt and fear. And then the carrot is we will protect your churches from Muslim extremists. We will allow tourists to come in and visit the pilgrimage sites if you lay off from criticizing Israel. When Christians do criticize Israel, then the shutters go up.
And Mahmoud, as a journalist, I want to ask you specifically about the media. One of the people emailing in there said that, deliberately the truth was being kept because the West is Christian. There are Christians being discriminated against and attacked in Israel. But Christians worldwide, they need them to support Israel, so they're not telling them about that. Is that a fair characterization?
That's a very fair characterization. And if you look at the broader picture, so that it's not, we don't single out Israel on this. The tactic of divide and rule or claiming to be a protector of minority is applied by all colonial powers, by foreign occupations, and even by dictatorship in the region. So really Israel is just following a system that works. It's less likely to work, thankfully, in Palestine, because Palestinian Christians are very much aware of this than elsewhere in the Middle East. Palestinian Christians are pressuring the Vatican to intervene, but the Vatican is really under pressure because of its perceived, Pope Pius was silent during the Holocaust, and there's still a problem with the canonization of Pope Pius. Yeah. And the Vatican feels it wants to part from that allegation, be it true or not, of being hostile to, remember, Europe, all of it was anti-Semitic, not just the Nazis. Yeah. And by Europe, we mean its churches, its institutions. So to distance themselves from this anti-Semitism, they created a new concept of the Judeo-Christian. It never existed back in the 40s and the 50s. But unfortunately, it's been used by Israelis to their favor to muddy the waters.
Stephen, we have this weird situation where Palestinian Christians are anti-occupation, in solidarity with Muslims. Yet many Christians around the world, you have this phenomenon of Christian Zionism, are actually pro-Israel.
Well, when they visit the land, they often wear their sunglasses so they don't actually meet the Palestinian Christians. They go from site to site. They have a Jewish guide. They stay in Israeli hotels. And they never meet the local Palestinian Christians. So there's a separation, if you like, within the church, which is deeply, deeply insulting to Palestinian Christians who say, come and sit with us, listen to us, learn from us. we go right back to the first century.
But do you blame the media for that? Do you blame a lack of awareness for that? Is there a religious justification for it?
It's the media partly and the Israeli propaganda machine, which has exploited the gullibility of the Christian church in the West. They cite the Bible, they emphasize how Israel has turned desert into a land flowing with milk and honey, bringing democracy to the Middle East. They exploit the sentiments of Christians in the West. And that's why our responsibility is to advocate for the Palestinians, Muslims and Christians, tell their story and correct the imbalance in the West.
Okay. All right, well, I'm going to come back to you guys in a few minutes, but we are going to move on again because one of our reporters, Luke Mason, recently attended a demonstration in London when Israeli Justice Minister Tzipi Livni visited the country. Livni had to be granted special immunity to make the trip after lawyers threatened to issue a war crimes case against her. Here's Luke with more.
Israeli politician Tzipi Livni has been allowed to travel to London today to give a speech hosted by the Jewish National Fund. Livni was one of the key architects of the Israeli attack on the Gaza Strip between December 2008 and January 2009. The attack killed at least 1,400 Palestinians, 313 of which were children. Many are gathered here in London today, outraged by her visit. Before her arrival, the British government gave Livni diplomatic immunity as she faced the very real prospect of being arrested for war crimes committed in 2008 and 2009.
The only reason why Tzipi Livni is in this country is because she's been given immunity from prosecution by the government. She carries on trying to evade justice. She narrowly escaped an arrest warrant in 2009. She was given immunity again in 2011 and again today.
Many people here today have tried to analyse Livni's visit, believing that it's a way for Israel to save face since the botched so-called peace talks.
I think it's an attempt to rally their support in a situation where the talks have broken down. The negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis are falling apart, and the responsibility for that lies with the Israelis.
The move to give Livni immunity from prosecution is being seen as a growing realisation by Israel's allies that Israeli officials are no longer able to act with complete impunity towards the Palestinian people, and that they will increasingly be held accountable to international law.
We're here to protest against Tzipi Livni. She's coming here to raise funds for Israel, and we're here to try and protest it because she's a war criminal. She has to be prosecuted, not to enter the UK. But she entered the UK, and we are here to try and protest against that.
Luke Mason reporting for The Sun Will Rise.
Mamoon, your thoughts on Tzipi Livni coming to the country?
Unfortunately, that's when the laws were tampered with the universal jurisdiction. I mean, the British justice system should have remained the way it was, and anybody who's accused of war crimes should be prosecuted here. Yeah. But unfortunately, here we've got politics intervening in the judiciary, and that's
the relationship between the UK and Israel is just too strong, isn't it? I mean, Mamoon, if we can get back to the topic of the show and Palestinian Christians. I mean, you know, relations between Christians and Muslims around the world, in some areas, they aren't too good, are they? Like Nigeria, for example, and, you know, Sudan, elsewhere. Right. But Palestine, it seems to me, it's actually a shining example of cooperation, isn't it? And harmony.
That's what makes the initiative counterproductive, but you should always be careful, because sometimes things which are projected or perceived may become a reality in the future. And that's what many dictators in the Arab world have been doing. Yeah. They keep recycling that the Muslims or the religious Muslims are anti-Christian. It creates an atmosphere of mistrust. And this atmosphere becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. So we must always remain vigilant. But luckily, the Palestinians...
Why is Israel doing this now? I mean, have they tried these tactics to separate Christians and Muslims in the past?
I'm not aware of anything significant as this now. They're calling the Christians a minority, a non-Arab minority. I think that's unprecedented. The fact that
is it a sign of desperation on their part, or
it could very well be that the tide is turning, and people are becoming more vocal and critical of Israel, and it could be just another desperate attempt. But we should always be careful of these attempts.
Yeah, I mean, if I can kind of understand some demographics here, Christian. I'm not sure. Sorry, Stephen. I'm not sure about my figures, but is it about 5% of Palestinians are Christians? And out of that 5%, they're very well represented in Palestinian life, aren't they, in politics and all the major professions?
It does vary considerably between the West Bank and the state of Israel, pre-67 borders.
Okay.
You've got about 150,000 Palestinian Christians in Israel. They represent about 1-2%. In the West Bank, it's 5-6%, about 200,000. But as Mamun has said, they are shrinking, and we are anticipating the exodus of the historic Christians from the Palestinian territories.
Looking at it from a very bleak perspective, could you envisage one day, if the current trajectory continues, that there will be a Palestine, a Holy Land without Christians?
Yes.
It's that bad, is it?
Various archbishops in the past have predicted that the only Christians left will be expat professors, clergy, there to help with pilgrimages. It's a very real fear, and it's one that we take very seriously, and that's why we're advocating for the indigenous Palestinian Christians.
That's not at the top of the agenda of the various Christian churches around the world, is it?
It's becoming so slowly. The Palestinian Christians themselves created a document called Kairos Palestine. Kairos means the moment or the time. And churches around the world are responding to the Kairos call to show solidarity with them and advocate for boycotts, divestment, sanctions, and promoting responsible tourism, where we visit Palestine and meet with local Christians, support their initiatives, their hospitals, their schools, their orphanages and so on, and raise the profile of them in the West.
Mamoun, are there any rays of hope here? I mean, this show is supposed to accentuate the positive about Palestine. Are there any rays of hope at all for Palestinian Christians?
Lots of Palestinian Christians, when they have the opportunity, and it's the easy way out to migrate, but I believe in the feeling of resistance that many other Palestinian Christians that share with their Muslim fellows. So I think Palestine will never be empty of Christians, of Palestinian Christians. I think they will resist, and they stay in their larger numbers.
Stephen, we've got about 20-30 seconds left. Last word to you. Any rays of hope?
Hope. The hope is that the arc of history bends toward justice, and I believe that what Israel is doing is wrong, and God will hold Israel accountable for the way it's treating its minorities. So I am hopeful, but we must be ready for the fact that the indigenous Palestinian Christian community is close to extinction. We've got to do something for them.
Close to extinction. Okay, a sad way to finish the show, but thank you very much, gentlemen, for coming in today. That is all the time we have for today. Once more, thank you to our guests. And don't forget to get busy on our social media pages, telling us what you think of the issues raised in this program. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next time for more discussion and analysis on Palestine. Bye-bye.